समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या समझ में नहीं आया?
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
By any measure, India's quiet winding up from the Ayni airbase in Tajikistan marks the end of an important, if understated, chapter in its post-Cold War foreign policy and Central Asia engagement. Now, the base, known locally as the Gissar Military Aerodrome, was India's first and only real overseas military facility, established in the early 2000s as a part of a bold attempt to project power into Central Asia. Now, when I emphasize the word real, it is to highlight the distinction between a true overseas military base and the kinds of facilities India typically operates. A classic example of an overseas base is what the United States maintains in, let's say, Germany or Japan, which is commanded by American officers, governed under US laws, and it also enjoys a degree of extraterritorial control. Now, India's arrangements abroad are fundamentally different. Now, what New Delhi has maintained so far are detachments or access facilities where Indian personnel operate with the consent and in close coordination with the host nation, rather than under Indian sovereignty. The only times India has briefly operated bases outside its borders were during wartime or peacekeeping interventions. For example, in 1971, during Bangladesh Liberation War, Indian forces temporarily used a couple of bases in Dhaka before quickly winding them up. A similar pattern followed during the Indian Peacekeeping Force mission, the IPKF mission in Sri Lanka, where temporary installations were vacated once the operation ended. Even in Mauritius, India's presence takes the form of joint access and cooperation, not ownership. India has personnel stationed there, but the facilities remain under Mauritian control. Now, against that backdrop, the Ayni base in Tajikistan stood apart. It was India's only truly distinct overseas military foothold, an installation that symbolized the projection of Indian power and influence in a region crucial to its long-term security interests. And 2 decades later, that one-of-its-kind experiment has come to a close. Now, this episode offers a revealing look at the limits of Indian power projection, the fragility of Central Asian multi-vector diplomacy, the uneasy realities of great power competition that now define Eurasia, and the emerging hybrid models of strategic posturing. Now, pay attention to the hybrid models of strategic posturing because this is a key assertion I will return to later in the piece. So, how was this base born? This is an interesting story of geopolitical ambition. You know, Ayni's origins lie in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 attacks, when the United States invaded Afghanistan and the international order briefly seemed open to new alignments. In 2002, the government of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, advised by a generation of strategic thinkers, convinced that India needed to project power beyond the subcontinent, moved quickly to partner with Tajikistan. Furthermore, India's strategic interest in Dushanbe, which is Tajikistan's capital, and particularly in the Ayni airbase, also emerged directly in the aftermath of the 1999 Kargil War. The Kargil Review Committee had identified serious gaps in intelligence and early warning. Strengthening India's presence in Central Asia was seen as one way to address those shortcomings and enhance strategic depth. And after joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or the SCO, in 2017, New Delhi sought to reinvigorate its ties with Dushanbe, which had begun to weaken amid Moscow's apparent reluctance to support India's strategic presence in the region. So, the Indian Air Force and the Border Roads Organization spent roughly $70 million rebuilding the airfield just west of the Dushanbe. You know, its 3,200-meter runway could handle most fixed-wing aircraft, new hangars, fuel depots, and maintenance facilities were added. And I hope you are able to understand that it was not just an infrastructure project, it was a declaration of intent. For the first time, India had a military footprint outside its borders, situated a mere 20 kilometers from Pakistan-occupied Kashmir across the narrow Wakhan corridor and within reach of Afghanistan's northern frontier. Ayni symbolized New Delhi's growing confidence in its ability to operate west of the Himalayas without relying on Pakistani routes. At the time, the move was widely regarded a masterstroke. Ayni gave India an observation post near Afghanistan, a counterweight to Pakistan's influence, and a sign of New Delhi's willingness to engage with the geopolitics of Central Asia, a region long dominated by Russia and increasingly courted by China. And here you must be wondering why exactly Tajikistan matters so much. For India, Tajikistan was less about immediate military utility and more about strategic geography. Landlocked and impoverished, it is nonetheless the closest Central Asian state out of 5 Central Asian states to the Indian subcontinent and one that borders both Afghanistan and China. For Russia, Tajikistan hosts its largest overseas base and serves as a front line for the Moscow-led Collective Security Treaty Organization, or the CSTO, which is often called Russia's NATO. Now, for China, it is a crucial node in the Belt and Road Initiative and a buffer against instability spilling from Afghanistan into sensitive Xinjiang. So, in that crowded strategic environment, India's presence was symbolically significant, a reminder that Eurasia's security architecture was not to be a closed-door imperative, divided between China and Russia. In 2015 and 2018, Indian analysts still cited Ayni as proof of New Delhi's growing regional heft. Indian President Ramnath Kovind's and later Prime Minister Modi's visits reasserted the strategically substantive part of India's Central Asia engagement. Now, why did Russia and China call India the non-regional actor in Tajikistan when India started to wind up? And is that reading correct? By 2021, Tajikistan informed New Delhi that the lease would not be renewed. India was instructed to withdraw its personnel and equipment, effectively ending a 2-decade presence. That winding up concluded in October 2025, and that is when you started seeing all these reports. Now, reports indicate that Tajikistan declined to renew India's lease after pressure from Russia and China, both of which view New Delhi's continued presence as an unwelcome assertion of what they call a non-regional actor in their shared sphere of influence. Now, for Russia, India's presence should have been acceptable, perhaps even useful as a hedge against Western penetration into Central Asia. But as Moscow's dependence on Beijing has deepened following its confrontation with the West and the invasion of Ukraine and the war of grinding attrition, Russia's bandwidth has really significantly shrunk. It is getting clear that Moscow today must accept a narrower Eurasian order centered on its alignment with China, whether Russia likes it or not, or whether we like it or not. As for Beijing, the calculus is more straightforward. China's interest in Tajikistan, border security, BRI corridors, and influence over the Pamir region make any competing military presence undesirable. An Indian base just beyond Xinjiang's frontier was an irritant, and Chinese diplomacy reportedly made that clear to the Xiaopei. Ayni's closure also underscores the contradictions within the Russia-India-China trilateral framework. I'm sure you've heard about it a lot lately, which Moscow has actively promoted in Indian circles as a counterweight to West's influence. Now, in theory, RIC is a platform for cooperation among Eurasia's major powers. In practice, it offers little strategic coordination. The Ayni episode should prompt India to reassess how much strategic value these groupings actually deliver. And now let's take a look at the myth of multi-vector diplomacy. Central Asian governments often boast of pursuing a multi-vector foreign policies, balancing relations among Russia, China, Europe, and regional players like India and Turkey. But the Ayni episode exposes the limits of that balancing act. Tajikistan remains the poorest of the 5 Central Asian republics. Data from a Kazakhstan-based ranking agency shows it has the region's highest poverty indicators and lowest per capita income. In practice, its security relies on Russian troops and its economy relies on Chinese loans and investments. So when both Russia and China align in their preferences, smaller states have limited room to maneuver. Multi-vector diplomacy, then, it turns out, depends on great power equilibrium. When that equilibrium is recalibrated, room to multi-align inevitably comes under strain. And finally, what is the evolving concept of military basing in great power competition? The broader significance of Ayni's closure lies in what reveals about military basing in today's world. In their 2024 book, Great Power Competition and Overseas Bases, Andrew Yu and Isaac Cardon argue that bases are no longer just launchpads for combat, and they actually note the rise of hybrid basing models, dual-use boats, disguised facilities, or rotational access points that extend reach without permanent garrisons. And this is what I was referring to in the opening remarks. The logic here is clear. Physical presence, however modest, still matters. So India's modest presence at Ayni had exemplified this very principle. It gave New Delhi visibility and optionality in a volatile region. Its absence leaves a vacuum, symbolic and operational, that others, and in my opinion most likely China, is going to fill. And then more than anything, its timing amplifies the sense of loss. In the renewed contest for influence around Afghanistan, India's absence from its northern flank is striking. The Ayni base once offered vital access and intelligence reach. Yet, despite the promise of the 2012 Connect Central Asia policy and projects like Chabahar and the INSTC, India's regional engagement remains under-resourced and uneven. If New Delhi is serious about being a Eurasian power, it will need to pair ambition with endurance. I'll be back to discuss what kind of diplomatic engagement India pushes for in the current situation to close the loop on its AFPAK policy. Now, I know that many are saying India's presence at Bagram would probably do the trick. Now, I don't think a limited access to Bagram will substitute for a full-fledged military base at Tajikistan. But for now, stay tuned.